Hello, everyone out there in YouTube land. My name is Cole Anderson, and I'm your host on The Independent Pianist. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at an extraordinary work of what's usually called musical impressionism, which might not be entirely an accurate term for this music. Un barque sur l'océan is the third piece from Miroirs, which was a set of 5 pieces that Ravel dedicated to other members of Les Apaches. And Les Apaches were basically the Apaches, basically. We're just a group of like-minded musicians, artists, writers, so forth, who kind of banded together to share ideas and support each other as much as possible. So other members included the great Spanish pianist Ricardo Viñez, as well as the influential critic Calvo Caresi. Each one of the pieces from Miroirs was dedicated to a different member of Les Apaches. So these pieces were supposed to act as a kind of musical mirror that would be held up to the artistry and personality of each member. This particular piece was dedicated to the painter Paul Sord, who was described in his obituary as a kind of Ravel of painting. He specialized in these kind of exotic location paintings with really bright, vivid colors like these ones. Of course, it's really such an honor to have a piece like this dedicated to you. I would be really honored myself. And it even goes more further than that, because I think that this piece might be the most striking one of the set. He kind of hid that beneath this unassuming title, A Boat on the Ocean, but really this is one of the most groundbreaking pieces that Ravel wrote in those years, the early years of the 20th century. And Miroirs is already a set of pieces that is full of originality and artistic fire. But this piece is so original for its time, both in view of its poetic inspiration as well as the strides it makes in pianistic writing. There had been various water portraits, of course, for the piano before, by artists like Liszt and Debussy, and Ravel himself, of course. Liszt's famous Jeu de la Vie d'Est was one of the very first, but then, of course, there was also the first piece from Debussy's Images, the Reflections on the Water, and Ravel also wrote his own Jeu d'eau. But this was probably the first piano piece to expand the canvas to encompass the entire ocean. This was an ambitious task, but one that Ravel was fully capable of meeting, and he really pulled out all the stops of his pianistic technique and compositional technique to craft this extraordinary, kind of like a mini tone poem. And I also have a kind of a story about this piece, because I learned it many years ago when I was a student. And I'll never forget the way that one of my mentors talked about this piece before. This was Monique Dufil. Monique Dufil is a marvelous French pianist and pedagogue. She recently retired from teaching, but she was teaching at Oberlin for a long time, and she was teaching there at the same time that I was a student. Although I didn't actually personally study with her, I got to hear her speak and teach many times over the years. She's a very inspiring personality, and she has a lot to say about French music. She had a very interesting take on this piece in particular. She was very critical of how most pianists approach this piece. She felt that generally people approach this in too sensual of a way. They make it too bright and kind of technically obvious, with fast tempi, lots of rubato, brilliant scales, so forth. To a certain extent, of course, you can't avoid that because the technical difficulty is there. But to her, she saw this work as really a very dark, very sad piece, because it made her think of the fishermen off the coast of France who, year after year, would put out to sea in their boats, very small boats, to bring back sustenance for their families, and often enough would never return. And I think that the image of the elemental power of nature and of the human fisherman's powerlessness against nature's strength was a very poignant image that forever changed how I conceived of this piece. In the analysis, I give my idea of a possible program for the piece, and I interpret the various melodic motives, of which there are only a few. It's very melodically economical. I interpret each of these motives as representing some programmatic element: the ocean, the storm, the boat, and the fisherman, so forth and so on. It's important to note also that, beautifully descriptive as this piece is, it also functions marvelously well as a piece of absolute music. So structurally, It's a little bit in the tradition of the symphonic poem of Liszt and Strauss. And in another sense, this piece is also typical of Ravel's tendency towards neoclassicism. So specifically, he uses a suggestion of classical sonata form as the basis for the structure of this piece. I feel like I'm always talking about sonata form because it was such an influential form and so often used and developed by later composers. Anyway, in this case, there are markers of sonata form. There are recognizably 3 different theme groups in the opening section of the piece. The opening section of the piece eventually moves from the tonic, basically F sharp minor, to dominant, C sharp major, very much like a sonata form. There's a brief recap of the first theme at the start of the development section in the dominant, C sharp major, also very typical for a sonata form piece. The original ideas are also all recapped, although a little bit transformed and in a different order this time. This time we end with the first theme to create a kind of arch structure in the music. So, granted, this is only a suggestion of sonata form, and there are many added features, as well as many things that have been removed or reordered or extended. So we don't see the usual kind of transition between themes in a sonata exposition. Instead, we get a totally new idea that acts as a long introduction to the second theme area, which is very dramatic. It really opens up the whole range of the keyboard, looking forward to the climax of the piece much later. As I said before, thematically, this piece is very straightforward. The arpeggio figurations, of course, represent the waves, whether they're calmly rippling or building to huge crests. And the gently rocking motive which opens the piece in the right hand, alternating duples and triples, I believe represents the little boat of the title. The melody and longer note values, which occasionally kind of peeks out of the texture and which sometimes is related to the boat theme, is meant to represent, to my mind, the human element, the voice of this lone fisherman facing the elemental powers of nature. Later on, there are motives that I associate with the coming storm, as well as with disturbances in the water and atmosphere which presage the storm and act as echoes of it later on. From a technical standpoint, this is one of the most difficult of Ravel's piano pieces. He oftentimes calls for extremely difficult figurations, which must also be played very softly and lightly. A good example of that is the passage leading up to the big storm, the climactic storm passage toward the end of the piece, at the end of the development-like section. It contains some of the most exposed and dangerous writing in the piano repertoire. It's very tricky to play well. I've spent many hours trying to conquer that passage. I never feel as comfortable as I'd like to when playing that. It took me several tries to get something that was pretty close. You'll probably notice there are a few wrong notes here and there and small inaccuracies in this performance. More and more, I find myself not being too concerned about these sort of small mistakes. When I have a take which is really satisfying from a musical perspective, rather than trying to re-record endlessly to get a note-perfect rendition that would probably end up being less inspired anyway, I just prefer to leave a few small blemishes in there. Of course, I could go in, thanks to the power of digital technology, and clean up the wrong notes in editing, kind of splice in the right notes, but I prefer to leave them in. That way it's more accurate. What you see my hands doing is what I'm really playing, and I think we should really be a little bit more relaxed with our fallibility as human performers. It's not really such a big deal if we admit that we can make small mistakes sometimes, and it doesn't ruin the musical image. For those of you who are attempting to learn this piece, I strongly recommend paying close attention to the rhythmic framework, the overall quarter note beats in this piece. This will actually simplify things technically quite a bit in many places. The smaller subdivisions of 30-second notes are constantly changing. So sometimes Ravel will write 8 30-second notes in a beat, or 7, or 12, or so forth. I think many performers tend to follow the small notes too much, actually, giving into a kind of woozy push-and-pull rubato constantly through the piece. And certainly there's nothing wrong with a bit of rubato. It's really necessary. But I think that if you at least attempt to play a little bit more straight and steady as far as the underlying quarter notes go, you'll find that Ravel has already written accelerandos and ritardandos into the music in the way he handles these smaller notes. So for example, in this passage, which I think represents the cresting of the waves, Ravel notates 8 notes in the first 2 beats and then 13 in the last beat, creating a natural acceleration of motion. I think that's quite intentional. I think a lot of people would actually play the last beat longer, kind of slow down on those last 13 notes to fit them in. But if you actually go with the motion, it creates a very exciting effect. On the reverse side of it, there are passages like this, where suddenly the motion is stripped away, and we move to bare 8ths and quarters. And at this point, you really don't need to either slow down more to accentuate this, or speed up to counteract this stripping away of motion. I've heard both approaches taken, and I think both approaches do a disservice to Ravel's idea here. He is really writing in a ritardando, a slowing down in the music. The only real exception to this is the climactic cadenza passage at the end, which is the storm, the huge hurricane, where I think it wouldn't make much sense not to allow a significant temporary increase in tempo. However, I think the passage leading up to this part is often played exaggeratedly fast compared to the rest of the piece. To my mind, it's supposed to be the calm before the storm, so I think we lose that a bit if the tempo runs too soon. If you are using the original Durant edition, the French first edition, or an edition that uses it as a reprint, so the Dover edition, for example, uses that, watch out for some misprints and missing accidentals. I've tried to mark them in the analysis, but there are several. I might have missed some. One such misprint at the climax would be pretty much beyond impossible to really deliver well, and I think should be avoided. It's that extra A there that's kind of stuck into the figuration. I think that's undoubtedly a mistake. Also, I think the last beat of this bar is a mistaken repeat of the previous bar. It's probably an engraving error. At this point, the harmony should continue on the same to the end of the bar, following what you have in the left hand. Also, be warned that in common with many of Ravel's piano works, there are times when this extremely meticulous composer has been almost too punctilious about indicating technical details which are not really feasible in performance. So attempting to reproduce exactly some of these effects will do you more harm than good when you're trying to learn this piece. A great example is at the crests of the waves that I talked about before, that same passage. Here, Ravel notates an extremely precise and pretty much impossible to execute figure at the end of the bar. And this is actually just showing that the right hand cannot physically continue the tremolo literally as written because the left hand notes overlap. So I remember trying to exactly do those notes at the end of the bar and having an extremely hard time doing it until I realized that really Ravel's just showing that you have to drop some notes for the tremolo in order to keep playing it. But if you try to do that literally, it's possible, but it's going to force you to slow down, and it will result in a noticeable weakening of the sound for the fortissimo downbeat that's coming up. I think here we should probably take Ravel's dynamics more seriously than the technical writing and allow a slight break in the right hand here instead of continuing the tremolo all the way to the end of the bar. And this is actually what people tend to do anyway. The thing is that this section passes so quickly that our ears fill in the gap in the right hand. So you won't even be able to tell that someone has left a little bit out. But if you slow down a video of someone playing this, you'll see clearly that they have to lift their hand before the downbeat, and they don't play the tremolo all the way to the end of the bar. So you always have to watch out for things like this in Ravel's music. Ravel had astonishing resources for beautiful sounds. He really expanded the technical resources of the piano, but he was not himself a virtuoso performer. He wasn't comfortable playing his most difficult pieces. So there are sometimes small defects from the point of view of technical practicality that you won't find in the scores of more native piano composers like Liszt, Mettner, Scriabin, and so forth. So anyway, I hope this is helpful for those of you learning the piece. Please enjoy the complete performance and analysis. As usual, consider supporting the channel as well. If you like what you see, if you want to see more of this content, you can sign up to make monthly pledges on patreon.com, www.patreon.com/independent pianist. You can also make one-time donations through PayPal or Revolut. I have links to those in the description box. And if you'd like to study with me, I do teach online. Just drop me a line at cole@independentpianist.com and we can have a consultation. But otherwise, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next week for some more great music.